Furious woman enters a church and shouts, "God, doesn't he exist?" Thunder cracked like a whip across the winter sky as St. Michael's Cathedral stood resolute against the howling wind. Inside, the ancient wooden pews creaked under the weight of the faithful gathered for evening mass, their prayers mingling with the scent of burning candles and centuries-old incense. The stained glass windows trembled with each gust, casting dancing shadows across the marble floor. Then the heavy oak doors burst open and she appeared, a woman drenched from the storm, her dark hair wild, her eyes blazing with a fury that made even Father Daniel step back from the altar. "God, doesn't he exist?" The scream echoed through the sacred silence, shocking the congregation into stillness. But it wasn't her words that froze the blood in their veins, it was the raw anguish in her voice, the sound of a soul shattered beyond repair. Before you dive into this powerful story of faith and redemption, take a moment to hit that like button and let us know where you're watching from. Your city might inspire someone else's journey of hope. Clara Thompson wasn't always the broken soul who stormed into St. Michael's that stormy night. Just 18 months ago, she commanded respect as a senior investigative reporter for the Boston Herald and served as president of St. Michael's Women's Ministry. Her signature pearls and warm smile were as familiar to the congregation as the church bells themselves. Every Sunday morning, Clara would lead the children's choir, her 7-year-old daughter Sarah's angelic voice soaring above the rest. Her husband, Dr. Michael Thompson, chief of oncology at Boston Children's Hospital, would watch proudly from the front pew, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners whenever Sarah hit a perfect note. They were the family others aspired to be successful, devoted and deeply rooted in their faith. Clara's investigative work focused on healthcare corruption, exposing insurance fraud and medical malpractice. Her stories had earned her multiple awards, but more importantly, they'd helped countless families receive justice. "Truth is God's language," she often said in her speeches at journalism conferences. "When we expose corruption, we're doing his work." The Thompsons lived in a modest colonial house, despite their means choosing instead to donate generously to the church's outreach programs. Every Christmas they hosted dinner for homeless families. Every Easter, Clara organized the community egg hunt. Their home was always open to those in need, their faith expressed through action rather than mere words. Father Daniel remembers the last normal Sunday he saw them together. It was early December, frost coating the church windows like delicate lace. Sarah wore a red velvet dress, rehearsing for the Christmas pageant where she would play an angel. Michael sat in his usual spot, reviewing patient files between hymns, always working to save one more life. Clara stood at the pulpit, reading the day's scripture with that quiet confidence that came from absolute faith. "None of us saw the storm coming," Father Daniel would later confess to his bishop. "How could we? They were our strongest members, our most faithful servants." Clara didn't just believe in God, she lived his word every day. She was the one who consoled others in crisis, who never wavered in her faith. The photographs from that final Sunday still hang in the church hall, Clara helping Sarah adjust her angel wings, Michael serving communion with his gentle doctor's hands, the three of them standing before the Advent wreath, their faces glowing with joy and purpose. They look untouchable in those images, protected by their faith and good works. But faith, as Clara would soon discover, doesn't guarantee protection from life's cruelest twists. Sometimes it's the brightest lights that cast the darkest shadows. Sometimes it's those who serve God most faithfully who find themselves tested most severely. And sometimes, as the parishioners of St. Michael's would learn that winter, the deepest questions about God's existence come not from atheists or skeptics, but from those who once believed with all their hearts. It began with a manila envelope left anonymously at Michael's office. Inside were documents revealing a sophisticated counterfeit drug operation targeting cancer medications at multiple Boston hospitals. Children were receiving saline instead of chemotherapy, their parents bankrupting themselves paying for water while cancer consumed their little ones. Michael spent 3 sleepless nights verifying the data, his hands shaking as he cross-referenced batch numbers. When Clara saw his haunted expression, she knew this wasn't just another story. This was a crusade. Together they began building the case, Clara's investigative skills complementing Michael's medical expertise. They didn't know Sarah had already received 3 doses of the fake medication. The first threat came on a Tuesday, a simple black rose on their doorstep. Then their brake lines were cut. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. "Think about your daughter," the voices would say. But Michael and Clara pressed on, believing truth would prevail, believing God would protect them. 2 days before Christmas, Michael didn't come home. They found him in the hospital parking garage, a single bullet wound to the chest. The police called it a robbery gone wrong, despite his untouched wallet and Rolex. Clara knew better. So did Sarah, who stopped singing after that day. Sarah's collapse came during the funeral. As Clara delivered the eulogy, her daughter's small body crumpled like a paper doll in the front pew. The cancer they discovered had spread everywhere. The months of fake treatments had given the disease free rein. But the true betrayal was yet to come. As Sarah lay dying, whispers began circulating through the congregation. Maybe Michael had been involved in the drug scheme. Maybe Clara's investigation was a cover-up. After all, how had they afforded their daughter's treatments on their salaries? Even as Clara kept vigil at Sarah's bedside, church members she'd known for decades stopped visiting. The women's ministry quietly elected a new president. The children's choir found a new director. Prayer requests went unanswered. Sarah died on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Michael. The church was half empty for her funeral. Father Daniel performed the service with tears streaming down his face, but the comfort of ritual felt hollow against the magnitude of Clara's loss. The final blow came a week later. The case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The judge, Clara would later discover, had a brother-in-law in the pharmaceutical company's board. Her editor, citing pressure from advertisers, killed the story. Decades of faith in justice, in community, in God himself, all destroyed in less than a year. Clara Thompson disappeared after that. The impeccably dressed reporter was replaced by a shadow haunting the streets of Boston like a ghost. Her phone went unanswered, her house dark. Until tonight, when she chose to make her return in the most devastating way possible by denouncing the very faith that had once defined her life. The Christmas Eve service at St. Michael's Cathedral was always special, but tonight carried a particular weight. Heavy snow fell outside, each flake catching the glow from stained glass windows that had witnessed a century of prayers. The congregation sat in reverent silence, their faces illuminated by candlelight, unaware of the storm about to break within their sacred walls. Father Daniel had just begun his homily about faith in darkness when the first crash of thunder shook the cathedral. His eyes drifted to the empty pew where the Thompsons once sat, where exactly 1 year ago little Sarah had sung her last Christmas carol. The memory of her voice, pure and clear, still haunted these ancient stones. In our darkest moments, he began, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling, God's light shines brightest. The massive oak doors exploded inward, bringing with them a blast of winter wind that extinguished half the candles. Clara Thompson stood in the doorway, snow swirling around her like a shroud. She was unrecognizable from the woman they'd once known, her designer suits replaced by sodden black clothes, her perfectly styled hair now wild and streaked with gray. But it was her eyes that stopped Father Daniel's breath. They burned with an intensity that spoke of madness, or perhaps something worse, absolute clarity. The congregation turned as one, gasps of recognition rippling through the pews. Mrs. Anderson, who'd once co-chaired the charity committee with Clara, clutched her pearls. Judge Harrison, who'd dismissed the corruption case, slowly slid lower in his seat. Even the choir fell silent, their carols dying in their throats. Clara took 3 deliberate steps into the cathedral, her wet boots echoing against marble. Water dripped from her clothes, each drop striking the floor like an accusation. The snow that had gathered on her shoulders began to melt, running down her face like tears, or perhaps they were real tears, frozen by grief and thawed by fury. 1 year, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. It was barely above a whisper, yet somehow more devastating than a shout. 1 year since my daughter died in this church, since you all gathered to pray for her soul while whispering about her father's. She reached into her coat and pulled out Sarah's small Bible, its pages dog-eared and worn. She read this every night in the hospital, every single night, even when the pain was so bad she could barely see the words. She believed until the end. Clara's laugh was terrible to hear. It held no mirth, only the kind of bitterness that comes from having every certainty stripped away. She believed in miracles, in justice. In all of you, her gaze swept the congregation, lingering on familiar faces that now turned away in shame. She believed in God. God doesn't He exist? Clara's scream shattered the sacred silence, echoing off centuries-old stone. If He did, my husband wouldn't be dead for trying to save children. My daughter wouldn't have died believing in miracles that never came. And you. She pointed at Judge Harrison, who seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. Wouldn't be sitting here pretending to worship while your corruption kills innocent children. Thunder crashed outside as if emphasizing her words. Father Daniel took a careful step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Clara, please. Don't. Her voice cracked like a whip. Don't you dare try to comfort me with empty words about God's plan. What kind of God plans for children to die from fake medicine while criminals profit? What kind of God lets good men be murdered for trying to save lives? The congregation sat frozen, caught between horror and fascination. Some began to pray quietly, their lips moving in desperate supplication. Others couldn't look away from the raw tragedy unfolding before them. You all sat here, Clara continued, moving down the center aisle, her wet footprints marking her path like tears on the marble floor. You sat here every Sunday, singing hymns and taking communion while you spread lies about Michael, while you abandoned my daughter when she needed you most. She reached the front pew, their old pew, and ran her hand along the polished wood. Sarah sat right here, singing her heart out to a God who would let her die in agony. Michael stood right here, serving communion to people who would later call him a criminal. Turning to face the congregation, Clara's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the cathedral. You want to know the real miracle? That any of you can still sit here in this house of lies pretending to be righteous. Lightning flashed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope shadows across Clara's face. In that moment she looked almost otherworldly, an avenging angel come to demand accountability not just from the congregation but from heaven itself. If God exists, she challenged, facing the crucifix above the altar, let Him show Himself now. Let Him explain to me why my 7-year-old daughter had to die believing in His love. Let Him justify why murderers and thieves sit in these pews while good men lie in graves. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Father Daniel stood motionless at the altar, his vestments glowing in the candlelight, his face a mask of compassion and uncertainty. The congregation waited, some in fear, others in shame, all wondering how this confrontation between grief and faith would end. Then from the back of the church came a sound that made every head turn, the clear, sweet voice of a child. The voice pierced the silence like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. Clara froze, her hand gripping the pew so tightly her knuckles turned white. That voice, it was impossible, yet achingly familiar. A small figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the cathedral, a girl no more than 7 wearing a red velvet dress that seemed to glow in the candlelight. Her dark curls fell past her shoulders exactly as Sarah's had, and her eyes held that same impossible wisdom that had always made Clara wonder if her daughter was somehow older than her years. He is here, the girl said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral. She began walking down the center aisle, each step deliberate and graceful. The congregation turned to watch, but their expressions were oddly blank, as if they couldn't quite focus on her. Father Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. He had buried Sarah Thompson 1 year ago today, had laid that small white coffin into frozen ground while Clara wept silently beside him. Yet here was a child who could have been Sarah's twin, down to the slight dimple in her left cheek when she smiled. The girl continued her slow progress toward the altar. As she passed each pew, the candles seemed to burn brighter, their flames reaching up as if drawn by her presence. The storm outside grew quieter, the thunder now just a distant rumble. Clara stood transfixed, her earlier fury forgotten in the face of this impossible moment. Her lips formed words, but no sound came out. The girl was now close enough that Clara could see the cross hanging around her neck, identical to the one she had buried Sarah in, a family heirloom passed down through generations. "You're not real," Clara finally whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't be." The girl stopped a few feet away, tilting her head in that particular way Sarah always had when she was considering something important. Why not, she asked, with such innocent curiosity that several people in the congregation felt tears spring to their eyes. Father Daniel watched the scene unfold, his theological training warring with what his eyes were telling him. In 30 years of priesthood, he had never witnessed anything like this. The girl seemed both completely natural and utterly otherworldly, as if she existed somewhere between heaven and earth. Because Clara's voice faltered. Because Sarah is dead. I watched her die. I held her hand as she took her last breath, as she stopped, choking on words too painful to speak. The girl stepped closer, close enough that Clara could smell the faint scent of vanilla that had always clung to Sarah's hair. "Death isn't the end, Mommy," she said softly. "You taught me that, remember." The word Mommy echoed through the cathedral like a bell, striking something deep in Clara's soul. She reached out a trembling hand, stopping just short of touching the girl's face. "Sarah," she breathed, hardly daring to believe. But before the girl could respond, another clap of thunder shook the cathedral, and in the brief darkness that followed, something changed. When the lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene through the stained glass windows, Clara saw something that made her heart stop. In the flickering light, Clara noticed that no one else was looking at the girl. The congregation's eyes seemed to pass right through her, focusing instead on Clara with expressions of concern and confusion. Even Mrs. Peterson, sitting closest to them, appeared to be staring directly through the child as if she wasn't there. Only Father Daniel's face showed recognition, his eyes wide with understanding. He had seen this child before, not just at Sarah's funeral, but in countless moments of deep spiritual crisis throughout his decades of service. Always the same girl, appearing to those whose faith was being tested beyond endurance. "Clara," Father Daniel said gently, taking a step forward. "I see her too." The congregation stirred uneasily, exchanging worried glances. To them, their priest appeared to be addressing empty air. Judge Harrison leaned over to whisper to his wife, "Poor man's lost his mind," along with her. But Clara barely heard them. She was transfixed by the girl, by Sarah, who now stood directly before her, small hand reaching up toward her mother's tear-stained face. The scent of vanilla grew stronger, mixing with the incense in a way that made Clara's heart ache with remembrance. "At Sarah's funeral," Father Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion, "when you were giving the eulogy, I saw her standing beside you. She wore that same red dress, the one from her last Christmas pageant. She was smiling, Clara, even as you wept." Lightning illuminated the cathedral again, and in that brief flash, Father Daniel saw what the others couldn't: a golden light that seemed to emanate from the child herself, casting no shadow on the marble floor. He had seen this light before in his darkest moments of doubt, when his own faith had wavered. "She appears," he said softly, "to those who need her most, to those whose pain threatens to separate them not just from God, but from their own humanity. I've seen her 3 times in my life, each time when I was ready to abandon my calling." Clara's hands trembled as she finally allowed herself to touch the girl's face. The skin was warm, real, yet somehow more than real. "But why?" she whispered. "Why now, after a year of silence? After everything we've lost?" The girl smiled Sarah's smile, complete with the missing front tooth from her last Christmas photo. "Because tonight you were ready to lose the last thing you had left, your faith in love itself." Father Daniel watched as understanding dawned in Clara's eyes. The congregation held their breath, witnessing something they couldn't quite comprehend: a woman seemingly conversing with empty air, yet transformed before their eyes from an avenging fury into something more vulnerable, more human. But as Clara reached to embrace the child, thunder cracked directly overhead. The cathedral plunged into darkness as every candle guttered out simultaneously. When the emergency lights flickered on seconds later, the girl was gone. Clara stood alone in the center aisle, her arms still outstretched to hold a daughter who was no longer there. But something had changed in her stance, in her expression. The raw fury had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of grief, wonder, and something that looked almost like hope. What happened next would shake the foundations of faith for everyone present, though each would remember it differently in the years to come. "She's not real," Judge Harrison's voice cut through the silence. "This is just another one of her manipulations. First the fake corruption charges, now this theatrical display." He stood up, his expensive suit rustling. "Father Daniel, surely you're not endorsing this blasphemy." Clara turned slowly to face him, but her expression wasn't angry anymore. Instead, she wore a smile that made the judge take an involuntary step back. "Tell him, Judge Harrison, tell him why you really dismissed our case." The congregation stirred uneasily. Mrs. Anderson, who'd been so quick to spread rumors about Michael, suddenly found her hymnal fascinating. Several board members of Boston General Hospital shifted in their seats. "I won't stand here and be accused," Harrison began, but Clara cut him off. "Your brother-in-law, Thomas Reed, Senior VP at PharmaCorp. The company that distributed the counterfeit drugs, the same company that donated $2 million to your re-election campaign through various shell corporations." Her reporter's instincts had kicked in, her voice steady and clear. "Would you like me to continue? Perhaps mention the offshore account in the Caymans?" Father Daniel watched the exchange with growing understanding. "Judge Harrison," he said quietly, "is this true?" The judge's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is outrageous. I came here to worship, not to be subjected to conspiracy theories from a grieving widow who's clearly lost her mind." "Lost my mind." Clara's laugh was hollow. "I lost my husband. I lost my daughter. I lost my faith. But my mind," she pulled a USB drive from her coat pocket. "My mind is clearer than ever. Michael wasn't just gathering evidence about the fake drugs. He found the whole network, doctors, administrators, judges, all profiting from children's deaths." The cathedral had grown so quiet you could hear the snow falling outside. Even the storm seemed to pause. "I didn't come here tonight to just rage at God," Clara continued, her voice carrying to every corner. "I came because I knew you'd all be here celebrating Christmas while the victims of your corruption lie in fresh graves. I came because Sarah made me promise, in her last moments, that I would make things right." Father Daniel stepped down from the altar, his vestments rustling against the marble steps. "Clara, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that faith without action is dead. That prayers without justice are empty." She turned to address the congregation. "How many of you knew? How many suspected but stayed silent? How many children died because good people did nothing?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the back of the church, a small voice spoke up. Mrs. Taylor, whose grandson had died of leukemia last spring, stood shakily. "Jimmy's medicine. It never seemed to work. When I questioned it, they said I was just being a nervous grandmother." Another voice joined in. "My sister's insurance claim was denied by your office, Judge Harrison. She lost everything paying for treatments that Mr. Rodriguez couldn't finish," his voice breaking. One by one, stories began to emerge. Years of suspicious deaths, dismissed concerns, buried evidence. The cathedral filled with voices, angry, grieving, finally speaking truth in a place meant for it. Father Daniel raised his hands, not to silence them, but in prayer. "Lord," he began, his voice trembling, "we have failed. We have allowed evil to flourish in our silence. We have valued comfort over truth, reputation over justice." Judge Harrison tried to leave, but found his path blocked by members of the congregation. Clara watched as the man who had dismissed her case, who had contributed to her daughter's death, was forced to face the consequences of his actions in the house of God. But something else was happening too. As each person spoke their truth, the candles around the cathedral began to relight themselves one by one. Not with dramatic flare, but quietly, steadily, like stars appearing in a darkening sky. And in the growing light, Clara saw her daughter again, not as a supernatural apparition, but in the faces of other children in the congregation. In their innocence, their trust, their right to live without falling victim to adult greed. The truth was pouring out now, unstoppable as the winter storm outside. But this was only the beginning. As confessions filled the cathedral, the storm outside reached a new intensity. Wind howled through the ancient stone walls, and the stained glass windows rattled in their frames. The sound mirrored the growing tension inside as more secrets came to light. The board meetings, Dr. Roberts stood up, his voice shaking. "We were told to look the other way. The numbers didn't add up, survival rates plummeting, costs skyrocketing. But they said questioning it would cost us our funding." His wife pulled at his sleeve, begging him to sit down, but he shrugged her off. "I can't stay silent anymore. Not here. Not tonight." Judge Harrison's face had gone from red to ashen. "This is madness. You can't prove any of this." Actually, Clara's voice cut through the chaos. She held up the USB drive. "Michael kept copies of everything, every email, every transaction, every death that could have been prevented. He knew they might kill him, so he made sure the truth would survive." Lightning flashed, illuminating the cathedral in stark white light. In that moment, Clara could have sworn she saw Sarah standing beside every person who spoke up, her small hand on their shoulders giving them courage. Father Daniel moved to the center of the aisle, his voice carrying over the storm. The church is not just a place of worship, he declared. It is a sanctuary for truth. Tonight we will hear every voice, face every sin, begin the work of true repentance. More stories poured forth. A nurse described watching children suffer while administrators counted profits. A pharmacy tech admitted to noticing irregularities in the drug supplies but staying quiet to keep his job. Each confession seemed to make the storm grow stronger, as if nature itself was responding to this cleansing of souls. Then Mrs. Peterson, who had led the rumors against Michael, broke down completely. "Clara," she sobbed, "we knew something was wrong. The day Michael tried to tell the church board about the corruption, I saw men following him in the parking lot. I said nothing. His blood is on my hands too." The storm reached its peak. A massive thunder crack shook the cathedral to its foundations. Several of the elderly parishioners cried out in fear as the lights flickered ominously. But Clara stood unmoved in the center of it all, like the eye of the hurricane. Her grief had transformed into something powerful, not the destructive fury of her entrance, but a force for justice, for truth, for redemption. Judge Harrison made one last attempt to regain control. "This is all very emotional, but without proper legal procedures." "The procedures you corrupted," Clara turned to him. "The system you twisted to protect criminals? No, Judge Harrison. Tonight justice comes from a higher court." As if in response to her words, the cathedral's ancient brass bell began to toll, though no one was in the tower to ring it. The sound rolled over the congregation like waves, each peal seeming to demand truth, demand accountability. Father Daniel raised his voice over the bell's toll. "In this holy place, before God and this congregation, let all truth be spoken. Let no sin remain hidden. Let no injustice stand." The storm, the bell, the confessions, everything built to a crescendo that seemed impossible to sustain. The very air felt charged with electricity, with the weight of secrets finally spoken aloud. And through it all, Clara stood firm, Michael's evidence in one hand, Sarah's Bible in the other. She was no longer just a grieving widow or a crusading journalist. She had become something more, an instrument of both justice and grace, of truth and redemption. But even as the storm of revelations raged, no one noticed the small figure in the red velvet dress moving silently through the chaos, or the way the candles flickered in her wake. No one except Clara and Father Daniel saw what was coming next, a moment that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, justice, and the thin line between heaven and earth. The cathedral doors burst open once again, this time admitting a squad of FBI agents led by Agent James Marshall, their footsteps echoing on marble as they moved purposefully down the aisle. Judge Harrison's face went from ashen to gray. "Perfect timing," Clara said quietly, though her voice carried in the sudden silence. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Agent Marshall, a tall man with steel gray hair and weathered features, stopped beside Clara. "M.S. Thompson," he nodded respectfully. "The evidence you sent this morning has been verified. We've been working on this case since Dr. Thompson's murder, but could never connect all the pieces until now." Judge Harrison lunged for the side door, but two agents were already there. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the cathedral like a final gavel falling. "Robert Harrison," Agent Marshall's voice was formal, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. Dr. Roberts, Mrs. Peterson, and others named in the evidence, please remain where you are. We'll need to take your statements." But something else was happening, something that made even the seasoned FBI agents pause. The candles throughout the cathedral began flickering in sequence, creating a path of light leading to the altar. The girl in the red velvet dress appeared again, standing at the end of this illuminated path. "It's not finished yet," she said, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. "There's one more truth to be told." Father Daniel stepped forward, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The church funds," he said quietly, "the ones that disappeared last year, supposedly embezzled by Michael." Clara's head snapped up. This was something even she hadn't known about. The priest continued, his voice growing stronger. $2 million from our endowment vanished. The board blamed Michael, said he must have taken it before his death. It was one of the main reasons people believed he was corrupt. He turned to face the congregation. "But I found something in the archives last week." From within his vestments, Father Daniel withdrew a file. The money was transferred on Christmas Eve, the night Michael died. But he was already dead when the transfer was made. The authorization came from. He paused, his voice heavy with sorrow, Bishop Lawrence himself. A gasp rippled through the congregation. Bishop Lawrence, head of the diocese, was one of the most respected religious leaders in Boston. The bishop, Clara, whispered, "But why?" "Because PharmaCorp needed to launder their payoffs," Agent Marshall interjected. "And what better way than through church renovation funds? We found similar transactions in 3 other dioceses." The girl in the red dress walked to the altar, her small hand touching the ancient wood. "Daddy tried to tell them," she said softly. "The night he died, he came here first. He thought the church would help expose the truth." Clara felt her knees buckle. Father Daniel caught her arm, supporting her as the full weight of the betrayal crashed down. The church itself, their spiritual home, their sanctuary, had been part of the machinery that killed her family. Lightning flashed again, and in its brilliant glare the girl seemed to glow from within. But this time others began to see her too. Agent Marshall blinked hard, his professional demeanor cracking. Several of the arrested conspirators fell to their knees. Sarah, Mrs. Peterson, breathed, her face white with shock. The girl Sarah smiled sadly. "You all forgot something important," she said, her voice echoing with that impossible wisdom that had always been beyond her years. "You forgot that God sees everything, every lie, every betrayal, every moment of choosing money over lives." The storm outside reached a fever pitch, but inside the cathedral an even more powerful storm was breaking, one of truth, justice, and divine reckoning. Clara looked at her daughter, really looked, and understood at last. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or seeking justice. This was about something far more profound, the redemption of faith itself. But as Sarah turned to face her mother, her expression changed to one of urgent warning. Because what was about to happen next would shake the foundations of not just the cathedral, but of everyone's understanding of justice, mercy, and the thin line between heaven and earth. In the back of the cathedral, unnoticed in the chaos, someone was reaching into their coat, desperation and fear having pushed them past the point of reason. The candlelight caught the metallic gleam of a gun. "No!" Sarah's scream pierced the air as Dr. Roberts pulled out the gun, aiming it at Clara. "You've destroyed everything," he shouted, his hand trembling. "Years of research, millions in funding, all gone because you couldn't let it go." Time seemed to slow. FBI agents reached for their weapons, but they were too far away. Father Daniel stepped forward, but froze as the gun swung toward him. The congregation ducked behind pews, screams echoing off ancient stone. But Clara didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked not on the gun, but on her daughter's face. In that moment she understood everything, why Sarah had appeared, why tonight, why in this place. "You're wrong," David, Clara said softly to Dr. Roberts, using his first name, reminding him of his humanity. "The research wasn't destroyed. The funding wasn't lost. Your soul was." The gun trembled more violently in his grip. "You don't understand. We were close to a breakthrough. The trial drugs weren't working fast enough. We needed more time, more money. The fake medications were just temporary." "Temporary," Clara's voice cracked like thunder. "Tell that to my daughter. Tell that to every child who died thinking they were being cured." Suddenly all the candles in the cathedral flared blindingly bright. Sarah moved to stand between her mother and the gun, her red dress glowing like ember in the intense light. "I forgive you, Dr. Roberts," Sarah said quietly. The doctor's hand began to shake uncontrollably. "Sarah? But you're dead. I signed your death certificate myself." "Yes," she answered simply, "and I felt every moment of pain as the cancer spread. But I forgive you, because that's what love does." The light from the candles grew impossibly brighter, and with it came a warmth that penetrated to the bone. Agent Marshall would later swear in his report that the light seemed to have substance, like liquid gold filling the cathedral. "Put down the gun," David, Father Daniel said gently. "Choose redemption over destruction. Choose love over fear." Dr. Roberts looked wildly around the cathedral. Every face he saw reflected not hatred, but a mixture of compassion and sorrow. Even those he had conspired with, now in handcuffs, nodded encouragingly. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering on the marble floor. He fell to his knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," he wept. "God forgive me, I'm so sorry." As agents moved to secure the weapon and take Dr. Roberts into custody, the mysterious light began to coalesce around Sarah. She turned to Clara one last time, her smile radiant with love. "Remember, Mommy," she said softly, "justice without mercy is just another kind of violence, and faith without love is just empty ritual." The light grew so intense that everyone had to shield their eyes. When it finally faded, Sarah was gone, but something had changed in the cathedral. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, with the tangible presence of divine love. Clara walked over to Dr. Roberts as the agents handcuffed him. She knelt beside him, took his trembling hands in hers, and said words that would be remembered and debated in theological circles for years to come. "I forgive you too," she whispered. "Not because you deserve it, but because Sarah taught me that forgiveness isn't about deserving, it's about healing, and we all need to heal." The storm outside had ceased completely. Through the stained glass windows, the first light of dawn was breaking over Boston, painting the cathedral in colors of hope and new beginnings. But this moment of grace was about to be tested in ways no one could have predicted. Because sometimes the hardest part of a miracle isn't believing in it, it's living up to it afterward. If this story of faith, forgiveness, and redemption has touched your heart, consider becoming part of our community by subscribing. Every subscription helps us share more powerful stories that remind us of love's transformative power. Together we can inspire hope in countless hearts. Thank you for being here. In the days that followed, as the morning news blazed with headlines about the Christmas Eve miracle at St. Michael's, the true weight of loss began to settle over the congregation like fresh snow on graves. The FBI investigation revealed depths of corruption beyond anyone's imagining. Bishop Lawrence was found dead in his study, an empty pill bottle beside a handwritten confession. 3 more children had died in the past week alone from the counterfeit medications. Each revelation was another wound in the community's collective soul. Clara sat alone in her empty house, surrounded by Sarah's things that she'd never had the courage to pack away. The pink ballet shoes still by the door. The half-finished homework on the kitchen table. Michael's coffee cup, unwashed from that final morning. Each item a testament to lives brutally interrupted. "They're calling it a miracle," Father Daniel said softly. He'd taken to visiting her each evening, bringing soup she wouldn't eat, offering prayers she couldn't say. The media, the Vatican investigators, even the FBI, they all want to understand what happened that night. Clara traced her finger along Sarah's Bible, its pages worn thin with love and faith. How many, Daniel? How many knew and stayed silent? The priest's silence was answer enough. The investigation had implicated nearly a third of the church board, 5 hospital administrators, and countless others who had chosen profit over children's lives. The pillars of the community transformed overnight into monsters wearing respectable faces. "The hardest part," Clara whispered, "isn't that they killed Michael and Sarah. It's that they did it while singing hymns and taking communion. They watched my daughter sing in the choir while knowing the medicine in her veins was water." Outside, protesters had begun gathering daily at the cathedral. Some demanded justice, others claimed the whole miracle was a hoax. The sacred space where Sarah had appeared was now marked with police tape, as investigators cataloged evidence and took statements. Mrs. Peterson had hanged herself in her garage, leaving behind a detailed confession and a check for her entire life savings made out to the children's cancer ward. Her suicide note quoted Sarah's words about forgiveness, but concluded, "Some sins are too heavy to carry." Dr. Roberts' wife had taken their children and fled to her mother's, unable to reconcile the loving father she knew with the man who had helped orchestrate such suffering. Their empty house stood like a tomb on Maple Street, windows dark, Christmas decorations still hanging like accusations. But the deepest tragedy was yet to be spoken. Clara hadn't told anyone, not even Father Daniel, about the letter she'd found in Michael's office. Dated the day of his murder, it revealed one final devastating truth that threatened to unravel everything, even the miracle itself. Some truths Michael had written are too terrible to speak, but silence kills more surely than any disease. Clara folded the letter again, her hands shaking. The paper was stained with what she now knew was her husband's blood. its contents would shake Boston's religious and medical establishments to their cores. More importantly, it would force everyone to question what they thought they knew about that Christmas Eve night. Because the greatest tragedy wasn't just the lives lost or the faith destroyed. It was the revelation that the corruption went far deeper than anyone had imagined, reaching into the very foundations of their beliefs. The letter contained a truth so devastating that Clara could barely bring herself to read it again. Michael had discovered that the counterfeit drug operation wasn't just about money, it was about power. The fake medications were part of a larger experiment, using desperate families as unwitting test subjects. They're studying how faith affects survival rates, Michael had written, comparing children who pray versus those who don't, measuring how long belief in God persists while receiving placebos. They're quantifying the death of hope, Clara. And the church isn't just complicit, they designed the study. Father Daniel found Clara at Michael's grave that evening, snow falling silently around her as she knelt in the frozen earth. "I can't release this," she whispered, holding out the letter. "It would destroy everything. Not just the church, but the very concept of faith for thousands." The priest read the letter, his face growing older with each line. The detailed documentation showed that multiple churches had been selected based on their congregation's strong faith. Children with cancer were specifically targeted because their families were most likely to turn to prayer. They monitored prayer groups, Clara continued, her voice hollow. Recorded confession sessions, tracked how often families attended Mass versus their children's survival rates. They turned suffering into statistics, faith into variables. The snow fell harder, covering Michael's headstone in a blank white sheet. Next to it, Sarah's smaller stone seemed to accuse them with its inscription, "Her faith moved mountains." Sarah knew, Clara suddenly realized, tears freezing on her cheeks. At the end, when nothing was working, she asked me if God was doing an experiment. I thought it was the medication making her confused. But she knew. Father Daniel gripped his cross so tightly his knuckles went white. "If this becomes public, every parent who lost a child will question their prayers. Every person who thinks God abandoned them will have proof. It won't just destroy the corrupt leaders, it'll destroy the faith of countless innocent people." The tragedy wasn't just in the deaths, but in the calculated manipulation of humanity's most sacred relationships between parent and child, between believer and God, between suffering people and those they trusted to help them. The snow continued to fall as Clara and Father Daniel sat in silence, the weight of this knowledge pressing down harder than the frozen earth on the graves before them. The choice they faced was impossible: reveal the full truth and potentially destroy the faith of thousands, or protect those same people by keeping silent the very sin that had enabled this tragedy in the first place. And somewhere in the growing darkness, a small figure in a red velvet dress watched unseen, knowing that the real miracle wouldn't be in what Clara chose to reveal or conceal, but in what would rise from the ashes of this deepest betrayal. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't in what we lose, but in what we must sacrifice to make things right. The truth revealed itself not in a thunderous moment, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. It was 3 days after Clara found Michael's letter when Father Daniel discovered the first discrepancy. Reviewing old security footage of the church, he noticed something extraordinary. Every time Sarah appeared in the Christmas Eve recordings, the cameras glitched. Not with static or interference, but with bursts of pure light that technicians couldn't explain. More revelations followed like dominoes falling. Agent Marshall uncovered records showing that Sarah's body had never actually been cremated as the hospital claimed. The funeral home had no record of receiving her remains. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Roberts, listed a time of death that conflicted with multiple witness accounts. Each piece of evidence suggested an impossible alternative, one that even Clara dared not consider. Then Mrs. Anderson, the church secretary, found an old notebook hidden in the cathedral's archive. It contained Sarah's drawings from her last weeks in the hospital, each page filled with detailed sketches of scenes that would later unfold on Christmas Eve. The final page showed the cathedral filled with light, and a single sentence in a child's careful handwriting: "Sometimes angels wear red velvet dresses." Clara spent hours comparing the handwriting to Sarah's old schoolwork, her hands trembling as she matched every loop and curve. The implications were staggering. Either Sarah had known what would happen months before her supposed death, or something far more miraculous was at work. The question wasn't just whether Sarah had appeared as a vision on Christmas Eve, it was whether she had ever truly died at all. Father Daniel's investigation into church records revealed more. The night Michael was killed, security cameras showed Sarah leaving the hospital, though no one could remember seeing her. The medicine she received in her final weeks came from a different supplier than the other counterfeit drugs. And most incredibly, her hospital room had been visited by a mysterious priest whom no one could identify, who left behind nothing but a faint scent of vanilla, the same scent that had surrounded her apparition in the cathedral. As these pieces came together, Agent Marshall made the most startling discovery of all. Hidden in the corrupted church files was evidence that Michael hadn't stumbled upon the fake drug scheme by accident. He had been deliberately positioned to expose it, guided by a series of anonymous tips and carefully orchestrated revelations. The entire investigation, from its beginning to its Christmas Eve climax, appeared to have been orchestrated by someone or something with an insight that bordered on omniscient. Clara sat in Sarah's room, surrounded by this new evidence, when she noticed something she'd overlooked for months. On her daughter's bedside table, tucked beneath her favorite stuffed animal, was a sealed envelope addressed to "Mommy, open when you're ready to understand." The postmark was dated the day before Michael's murder, but the handwriting was fresh, unmarked by time. With trembling fingers, Clara opened the envelope, and what she read inside would change everything they thought they knew about faith, justice, and the thin line between heaven and earth. Because sometimes the greatest revelations come not in what we discover, but in what we've known all along, waiting only for our hearts to be ready to understand. Inside the envelope was a simple drawing, Sarah's last artwork, showing the cathedral bathed in light, but this time with additional details that made Clara's heart stop. In the corner, written in Sarah's unmistakable handwriting, were names, dates, and account numbers that matched exactly with the evidence they'd uncovered. Below it was a message: God's justice moves like winter snow, Mommy silent but unstoppable. Trust the plan. As Clara absorbed this revelation, Interpol announced the freezing of multiple offshore accounts, their numbers matching those in Sarah's drawing. Within hours, arrests began across 3 continents. The corruption wasn't just local, it was a global network, and it was collapsing like a house of cards in a winter wind. Every arrest, every confession, every piece of evidence could be traced back to clues hidden in Sarah's hospital room drawings. The most stunning development came when Agent Marshall discovered that someone had been systematically transferring the stolen drug money to research facilities developing actual cures for childhood cancers. The transfers began the night of Michael's murder and continued through Christmas Eve, each one authenticated with an electronic signature that cybersecurity experts claimed was technologically impossible. It contained fragments of both Michael's and Sarah's DNA. Father Daniel, poring over centuries-old church records, found accounts of similar incidents throughout history, children who seemed to bridge the gap between heaven and earth, appearing in times of great corruption to restore faith not through grand miracles, but through the patient unfolding of justice. Each account mentioned a red dress, a scent of vanilla, and the presence of pure light. The media dubbed it the Christmas Eve conspiracy, but they missed the deeper truth. This wasn't just about exposing corruption or achieving justice. It was about something far more profound: the way divine intervention works, not through spectacular miracles, but through the patient orchestration of human choices, each person playing their part in a plan too vast to comprehend. Dr. Roberts, from his prison cell, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The night before Michael's murder, he had seen Sarah in the hospital chapel, glowing with an inner light, writing in her notebook. When he approached, she looked up at him with eyes that held the wisdom of ages and said, "Everything that is hidden will be revealed, Dr. Roberts. Love always wins in the end." He had dismissed it as the hallucination of a dying child, but now he understood. He had witnessed the moment when heaven's plan was set in motion. As winter deepened over Boston, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. Sarah hadn't just appeared on Christmas Eve, she had never truly left. Like snow accumulating silently until it transforms an entire landscape, she had been orchestrating events all along, using her father's death, her own apparent passing, and even the corruption itself as tools in a divine plan for justice and redemption. But the greatest revelation was still to come, hidden in the final pages of Sarah's notebook, waiting to be discovered. Because sometimes the deepest truths aren't found in what we see, but in what has been patiently waiting for us to be ready to understand them. 1 year after the Christmas Eve miracle, St. Michael's Cathedral stood transformed. The once shattered community had rebuilt itself, not through forgetting but through facing the truth with courage and grace. The pews were filled again, not with blind faith, but with a deeper understanding of what it means to believe in the face of darkness. Clara had turned the tragedy into purpose, establishing the Thompson Foundation for Medical Ethics and Faith. The organization, funded by recovered corruption money, worked to ensure transparency in pediatric care while providing support for families facing serious illnesses. In a twist of divine irony, many of the doctors and administrators who had once participated in the corruption now served on its ethics board, their experiences serving as powerful testimonies to the possibility of redemption. Father Daniel's homilies changed too. He spoke less of abstract faith and more about the practical work of love. The cathedral became known as a place where truth and mercy met, where those who had committed grave sins could find forgiveness, but only through genuine repentance and restitution. The Christmas Eve events had taught them all that true faith demands accountability. Dr. Roberts, serving his sentence, had become an unexpected agent of healing. From prison, he worked with investigators to expose similar schemes worldwide, his testimony saving countless lives. Every Sunday, he would receive communion from a prison chaplain while wearing a red tie, his personal reminder of a little girl in a red dress who had taught him about the power of forgiveness. The recovered funds had been used to establish a cutting-edge pediatric research center where scientists worked to develop real treatments for childhood cancers. Above its entrance hung a simple plaque with Sarah's words, "Love always wins in the end." The center had already made breakthrough discoveries, as if guided by an unseen hand. But the most profound transformation was in Clara herself. She no longer carried the burning rage that had driven her into the cathedral that stormy night. Instead, she moved through the world with a quiet strength, her faith restored not despite the tragedy but because of how grace had worked through it. She understood now what Sarah had tried to teach them, that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the dramatic displays of divine power, but the slow, steady work of love transforming human hearts. In Sarah's old room, which Clara had finally found the strength to enter, she discovered something remarkable. The walls, which she had remembered as pale blue, were actually covered with intricate drawings visible only in certain light, depicting events that had yet to unfold. The story, it seemed, was far from over. On Christmas Eve, exactly 2 years after that fateful night, Clara stood in St. Michael's Cathedral once again. The space was transformed not just by renovations but by the weight of truth and redemption that had reshaped every soul who gathered there. As snow fell softly outside, she noticed something that made her heart skip: a small red velvet dress hanging in the children's choir section, identical to Sarah's. The most remarkable revelation had come 3 days earlier when FBI forensics finally completed their analysis of Sarah's hospital records. They discovered that in the weeks before her supposed death, her blood samples had shown unprecedented changes, not the deterioration of terminal cancer, but something entirely different. The cells displayed patterns that defied medical explanation, as if they were being transformed by something beyond scientific understanding. Father Daniel had found ancient church documents describing similar cases throughout history, children who straddled the boundary between heaven and earth, their physical forms becoming vessels for divine intervention. These accounts were always associated with periods of great corruption and subsequent renewal, as if God occasionally sent his most innocent messengers to restore humanity's moral compass. The final piece fell into place during that evening service. As the choir sang Silent Night, a young girl's voice rose above the rest, pure, clear, and achingly familiar. Clara looked up to see a child she'd never met wearing the red velvet dress, but singing with Sarah's unmistakable style. Next to her, other children began to glow with an inner light, their voices joining in perfect harmony. They were all cancer survivors, their diseases mysteriously vanishing in the months following the Christmas Eve miracle. Dr. Roberts, watching the service via prison livestream, wrote in his journal that night, "I finally understand. Sarah wasn't just one child, she was every child, every innocent soul we betrayed. And now, through God's grace, they all carry a piece of her light." As the service ended, Clara discovered a new drawing had appeared in Sarah's Bible, one she knew hadn't been there before. It showed the cathedral filled with children in red dresses, each holding a candle, each face glowing with divine light. Below it, in Sarah's handwriting, were the words, "Love never dies, Mommy. It just transforms like light through a stained glass window, making everything it touches more beautiful." Clara understood at last. Sarah hadn't merely appeared as a ghost or vision. That Christmas Eve she had become something far more profound, a bridge between heaven and earth, her love fragmenting like light through crystal, embedding itself in the hearts of all those children who would carry her legacy forward. The miracle hadn't ended. It was still unfolding in every act of justice, every moment of forgiveness, every child's voice raised in song. And in the gentle snowfall outside, if one looked carefully, they might see a small figure in a red velvet dress, smiling as she watched her work continue through the heart she had touched, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles are the ones that never really end. Dear friends, this story of faith, redemption, and divine justice has touched many hearts. If you've been moved by Clara and Sarah's journey, please consider supporting our team by subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. Share this video with your loved ones who might need a reminder that miracles still happen. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. How has this story touched your heart? What moments resonated with you most deeply? And here's a question for you: should we create part 2 of this miraculous journey? Let us know in the comments if you'd like to explore what happens next in this extraordinary tale of love and faith. Together, let's spread hope and inspiration.